And yet we're here.
And yet we're here, right?
And we're here,
And
and
that's the
this is
bottom line.
where we want to be.
Good. We are in paragraph Dalet, chapter 24 of Shemos. So just to kind of reorient ourselves, because it has been, unfortunately, a little bit. So this parak, which occurs at the end of Parshas Mishpatim, um, which describes a series of events that takes place somewhere in the environs of the process of the revelation on Mount Sinai, is a little bit of a mystery, right? And as we said, there are fundamentally two approaches to this parak. One approach is to say that essentially this is a linear historical presentation of the events as they transpired. In other words, and this may be connected to a more global question of whether we make the assumption that the Torah, unless we have very, very good reasons to say so, right, works chronologically, linearly in the way that it presents events. Um, uh, if we were to take that approach, which again is that's the approach of the Ramban and many other Mefarshim, then the kind of buildup of events is that in the first week of Sivan, right, when the Jews arrive in by Har Sinai, right, we start with the events described in the 19th chapter of Shemos, right, where there's this kind of back and forth where God presents terms of the new relationship that the Sinai event kicks off. Moshe conveys them to the people. There are days of spiritual preparation for Har Sinai. Then there is the theophany, right, the great revelation that takes place along with the Aseret Dibros. Following that, we have the presentation of Parshas Mishpatim, right, of kind of a survey, right, of the laws that are found that, let's say, occupy kind of almost a constitutional core, right, of future Torah law. And then we come to Parak Daled, right, that however long, right, that Mishpatim was communicated, it would seem, in the immediate aftermath, right, of the giving of the Aseret HaDibros. And then we have the events of Parak Daled. Right, everybody with me so far, right, which again culminates at the end of the parak, where we're told Moshe then ascends to the cloud on the top of Mount Sinai for a period of 40 days to receive a further explication of the mitzvahs. Right, that's the we'll call that the sequential approach. Then we have the approach of Rashi that says all of Parak Daled, or most Parak Daled, we'll hopefully get to that today, is essentially a flashback. Right, and these are events that took place before, right, the events of Har Sinai, right, and the events of what we'll call, for lack of a better term, the events of Shavuos, right, of the presentation of the Aseret HaDibros, right, to the Jewish people, right. The Parach Dalet actually precedes all of that, and to a large degree, that it is almost a an expansion and amplification of the events found in Parak Yotes, right, chapter 19 of Shemos. In other words, that to really understand, according to Rashi, really to understand Parak Yotes, to understand chapter 19, right, that really that we'll call this a camera one and camera two kind of approach, right, that the Parach Daled can be almost like read as a commentary on Parak Yotes, on chapter 19, right? That it is giving a slightly different perspective, right, on the same events that are described in chapter 19. Everybody with me so far? Okay. So what we started doing last time we met is to go through the parak, and our agenda was we're going to go through the parak twice. We're going to go through the parak first using Rashi's approach, and and again, not just Rashi, but Rashi is the primary advocate for this idea, reading it as a flashback, right? And then we're going to come back when we're done with that, right, and go back and read it how we would understand the parak as it is sequentially, right? Everybody with me? So again, I have two methodological questions, which I'm not going to answer, but I think are important to kind of present to you before we start. And I don't really have the answers to these questions. Question number one, right, is as I alluded to before, right, to some degree, is this a question of a more general set of assumptions, right? Of do we assume that events in the Torah are sequential or not? In other words, is there a reason to assume that the Torah is sequential, right? So on the one hand, right, I think that would be our instinctive response, right? In other words, if we're reading kind of the flow and the narrative of the Torah, we kind of assume A comes before B, B comes before C, and so forth. Now, there are definite exceptions I think everyone would agree to, of the idea that the Torah will often kind of I don't know, often, will sometimes, right, kind of replay events, right, from multiple perspectives, right, or in terms of finishing up one story before proceeding to the next, right? So I'll give you two examples of this phenomenon, right? One is that in Parshas Vayishlach, right, after Yaakov returns from his whole sojourn in Lavan's house, right, we're told about the death of Yitzchak Avinu, right, and of his burial in Ma'aras Machpelah. Now, if you do the math, right, and it's not, we know how long Yitzchak lives, we know how old he was when Yaakov was born, right? We can do the correlations, right? It turns out that Yitzchak does not die at that point in the story, right? Yitzchak actually, it's almost, I would say, 100% clear that Yitzchak is still alive when Yosef is sold into slavery, right? And yet, right, the story that the Torah does not present it, right? And the Torah could have said, right, when it's describing, let's say, the years of, I don't remember exactly how old he was when he died or when that was, right? To interrupt the story of Yosef with that information. And Yitzchak passes away, and Yaakov and Esav bury him in Ma'aras Machpelah, but it does not, right? In other words, it's tying up the loose threads of the story of Yitzchak after Yaakov returns, right? And does not want to address that. It's not really part of the story of Yosef. Right? In other words, even though the chronological instinct, right, would put it there, right? That's not where the Torah presents it. That's example number one. Example number two, and perhaps this is even more significant, is the description of the consecration of the Mishkan. Right? And it was the day, which again we usually assume is the beginning of the month of Nisan in the second year following the Exodus, right, is described at the end of Shemos, right, in terms of primarily focusing on Moshe's activities, right, and the setting up of the Mishkan, qua the Mishkan. It is then those same events, and really going back a little bit, are described in Vayikra with the focus on the initiation of the Kohanim, right, and then again in Sefer Bamidbar, right, it is described with what's actually the Torah reading for Hanukkah, right, which is the gifts that the Nesiim, that the princes of each tribe presented, right, in the first 12 days of the Mishkan, right? So again, here, not only is it not presented together or consecutively, right, the story is effectively retold, right, each one from a different perspective. And the truth is, in that particular example, it has a lot to do with what the theme of each sefer individually is, right? In other words, it's told from the perspective of the capstone of Sefer Shemos. It's told from the perspective of Vayikra, right, which is called Toras Kohanim, right, the law of the Kohanim, right, because it's about how the Kohanim become the Kohanim at that same time, right? And in Bamidbar, which is the book of the Shvatim, right, the book that the tribal unit, right, is almost the defining feature from the beginning of the Sefer to the end of the Sefer. So there, it's about the Korbanos Hanasiim, right? The sacrifices of the princes of each chapter. That's a classic example, right, of events that are described from multiple perspectives in multiple presentations. And if you would be interested in really doing the timeline of the week, you would have to take all three accounts, right, kind of put them next to each other and carve them up, right, of how they integrate with each other. Everybody with me so far? So the question is, what's driving, right, let's say the approach of Rashi versus the approach of the Ramban, right? Is it a general assumption about whether the Torah is at least usually, let's call it, sequential until proven guilty, right? Or is it, no, in other words, like this is a regular tool of our interpretation of the Torah, right? To be able to say that there's no real reason to assume any kind of sequence, right? So that's number one, right? Is this driven by a general approach, right? Or is this somehow specific to the details of our story? And related, there's a question of what we're about to do, right? There's a little bit of the question of the chicken and the egg. In other words, how we read this parak, right, and how we understand the unfolding of the events of the parak. If this is pre-Aseret HaDibros, right, we're going to read a number of the details differently and understand the story as a whole differently. And if it is the aftermath of the Aseret HaDibros, then it becomes a different story. In other words, we are so the question is which drives which. In other words, is it, we have a number of textual questions of how to read the parak, right? And those questions lead us to posit where it lies on the timeline, or no, right? Do we start with our understanding of the timeline and that drives how we interpret details? Does that make sense? Make sense? Okay. And by the way, it's not a binary. It could be that there are certain things within the parak that are the driver of the interpretation. And once that's in place, right, then the other details are understood through the prism of that assumption, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other, but I think these are important questions to keep in the back of our mind as we go through the parak. And again, as an example of something we already did, right, we talked about the question of, we are told that Moshe tells the people the Divrei Hashem, the Kol HaMishpatim, right, the words of God, and all of the Mishpatim, all of the laws, right? And we went through a number of possibilities of what those things mean, right? What are the Divrei Hashem, and what are the Mishpatim, right? And we said, in general, right, that if we assume, right, the Perek Chav Daled follows what we call Parshas Mishpatim, right? The Torah, the section that begins, Eila Mishpatim Asher Tasim Lehem. These are the laws that you should present before them. Then, what are the Mishpatim that he tells the Jewish people? Clearly, or almost clearly, right? It's Parshas Mishpatim, right? That is the kind of the obvious assumption, right? If that is the case, right? Whereas, if you assume that this takes place before Matan Torah, right? Then we may have to work a little bit harder, right, to explain what Hamishpatim means in this context, right? So again, Rashi, right, who has that approach, right? Rashi says, what are the Mishpatim? It's Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, right? The 7 Noahide laws, as well as the laws that they had received. Again, and here he's drawing back on that measure that we talked about before, right? In Mara, right? Earlier in their wilderness experience, right? Which again, there's a certain weakness of that approach of why is he telling them things that they already know, right? As you would think, right? Our more instinctive approach would be to say, well, he's telling them new information, which is shaping the rest of, what happens in the parak, right? So the question is, I guess the point I'm trying to make, and I guess a little sensitive about my like clarity today, right? So if I'm looking for additional reassurance, you'll take it as a um, is the reference to Mishpatim, right? What's leading the Ramban and those who accept his approach to say that, yes, this is clearly taking place after Parshas Mishpatim, right? Or do they, for whatever reason, already have this assumption in place, right? That this parak happens afterwards, right? And that therefore their interpretation, whether Rashi or the Ramban, right, is dictated by their assumption about the parak rather than leading to the assumption about the parak. Okay, good. Fine. So we will pick up. How long did that take? Um, we'll pick up in Parachav Dalid, Pasuk Dalid, right, verse 4. Smadar, I'm going to ask you to read. Yeah.
ויכתוב משה את כל דברי השם, וישכם בבוקר, ויבן מזבח תחת ההר, ו12 נציבה ל12 שבטי ישראל. And Moshe wrote all of the things that Hashem said, and he got up in the morning and he built a mizbeach at the bottom of the mountain, and 12 monuments for the 12 tribes.
Okay, so we're told Moshe does both writing and building here, right? He writes down something called Kol Divrei Hashem, all the words of Hashem, which again, which may refer to what we said in the last pasuk, right, where Moshe tells the people Kol Divrei Hashem v'Mishpatim. What's interesting is that Rashi here says that this is actually, he says, this is Mibreshis v'ad Matan Torah. This is actually, whether Rashi means that literally, in terms of that what's written in this document that Moshe is now presenting over here, right, is literally from the very beginning of Bereshit to Matan Torah. But the idea, whether in full form or in summary form, this book contains kind of the record of the Torah to date, right? And there's all of the events of the Torah. And again, as a little bit of a sneak preview, this is what will be referred to as the Sefer HaBris, right? The book of the covenant, right? Which is then going to be read as part of the ceremony that ensues. So if we're going to take Rashi's approach, right, and the Sefer HaBris, right, includes kind of all of Chumash, right, the last 11 years of Shir, or whatever it is, 12 years of, I guess up to whatever it is, of Shir, right, and there's all of that is what's presented. How do you understand that? And there's the idea that the Sefer HaBris, right, the book of this covenant, which is being revealed here, right, comprises all the Torah to date. How do you understand that?
I can't even understand how we could write all of that in one morning and then build something and it's still the beginning of the day.
Well, the writing takes place, if we want to be like strict about it, the writing takes place the day before. So again, you could theoretically posit that it's miraculous on some level. We have such an idea by Moshe, writes the final version of the Torah on the last day of his life, and there are midrashim that talk about the idea that it was miraculous and so forth. Or in other words, even in Rashi's approach, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Sefer HaBris includes like literally all of Sefer Bereshis. In other words, it could be the highlights. And it was the idea though that I think the core of what Rashi is saying is the Sefer HaBris is the encompasses, right, the critical events right, that are described in the Torah to date, right? So let's take that as our, how are you going to work that? So why is that kind of the document of the bris?
You said it includes the critical components. Well, how do you edit the Torah and decide what's important and what's not?
That's why he gets to be Moshe Rabbeinu.
Excuse me?
That's why he gets to be Moshe Rabbeinu.
I understand. This is making me feel like I'm never going to get this. And like you were concerned with something being either repeated or out of order, so to speak. I mean, people like myself, like I'm just trying to learn. I would love it if it were linear because I could like understand.
Sure.
But I'm not bent out of shape if something is out of order or repeated, because I always feel when something is repeated, it's real important.
Okay.
It's like listen up, folks. So I'm sorry, that's all I have to say.
Okay. So let's go back to the Sefer HaBris then.
Excuse me?
Let's go back to the Sefer HaBris, right? And there's the idea that this is the book of the covenant, right? And so again, right, we're building it. Moshe builds a mizbeach. They offer sacrifices, right? And then there's the ceremony where he reads the Sefer HaBris to the people, and they affirm Kol Asher Diber Hashem Naaseh V'Nishma, right? Whatever Hashem says, we are committing to do. So, what's the function of the Sefer HaBris?
So Sefer HaBrit, referring to the Brit between Hashem and our patriarchs?
Okay, so good. So
Which was in Sefer Bereshit.
good. So it could be, right? And this is certainly a plausible understanding, right? That the bris of Sinai, right, is not out of nowhere, right? And that it is in certain ways a extension, a reworking, right, of bris avos, right, of the covenant that God made with the patriarchs, right? And there's that again. We're taking it to a new level, right? And there's that there are a lot of there are new expectations, right? There are going to be new rules, but the idea that we are the Jewish people are signing onto this to some degree, right? In response to their past history, right? And this, again, if we are going to, like Rashi, right, view this parak as an amplification of the events of Parak Yutes. So one of the things that we found there, right, is remember when God comes to Moshe and he says, you saw all the miracles that I did in Egypt, how I took you on the wings of eagles and brought you to me. And now I'm giving you the opportunity that you will be a mamlechas kohanim v'goy kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, right? That the pitch, so to speak, right, is based on the idea of past history, right? The idea that, we've come this far, right? And here again, in Rashi's understanding, that this goes back to the kind of very beginning of the Torah, right? And on this basis, right, and there's like that in officially accepting the bris, right, which again, all of this is lead up to Har Sinai, according to Rashi, right? That they are saying, okay, like we understand, right, and we accept going forward, and by dint of that, they are worthy, right, of the Sinai experience, right? Fine. So then there is this construction of matzevos, right, of pillars, right, which are distinct from the altar, right? And Moshe puts up two things. He puts up an altar and he puts up these monuments, which again is very explicit. The monuments represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, again, given that this chapter is about this Krisas Bris, right, this making of a covenant between God and the Jewish people, right? And a covenant is an agreement between two parties, right? The idea that there is this physical structure, right, that is built, right, that kind of represents the totality of the Jewish people, right, makes sense in the light of that, okay? Then we are told, and this is actually quite fascinating in its own right, that who offers the sacrifices at Har Sinai here?
Is this the youth, Na'arim?
Right, it says Na'arei b'nei Yisrael, right? The youth or the young men of the Jewish people. They are, now this is quite fascinating, right? Some say, including Rashi, that this is specifically the Bechorim, right? Some of you maybe, we have this idea of Kedushas Bechor, right? Of the sanctity of the firstborn, which to some degree, at some point later, is attenuated and switched over to the Kohanim, right? And there's the idea that in the first iteration, right, of our religious life, the people who are supposed to be the agents of the people in their relationship to God are not the Kohanim, but are the Bechor, right? And that after the events of the Egel Zahav, that shifts, right? And we have this new paradigm that begins. Alternatively, right, we could read this as just wider, right? That it's, well, let me back up for a second, right? So the difference, right, between Bechorim, right, versus Kohanim, right, in terms of the Bechor of each family versus having a distinctive clan of Kohanim, what's the difference in impact of that?
The Bechor is everybody. I mean, giving everybody the opportunity, Bnei Yisrael.
Good. There's a more, let's call it egalitarian impulse here. There's the idea that like the Kohanim are not a people set aside. It's the idea that every family, right, has their own Kohen, right? Lahavdil, they used to say that, in Irish families, right, that there's always like the one kid that became the priest in the family, right? And the idea that creates a certain different level of investment, right, in the avodah on the part of everyone else, right? At the end of the day, we don't embrace this model, but it's interesting that the only place that we explicitly see, even though we have this idea, right, floating around, right, of the Bechorim being the, this like quasi Kohanim. Before that, the only explicit place we're told that there is these apparently non-Kohanim serving as Kohanim is in this story of the bris, right? And the idea that like this is yet another detail about how this is a story about the Jewish people as a totality entering into this covenant with God. Fine. The last thing that I'll say over here, I see Leslie's already shut the Chumash, ready to roll, is that the sacrifice that are being offered here, it's also noteworthy that this, and I think this may be the first time we encounter this in the Torah, that in addition to the Karban Olah, right, to the idea of the burnt offering, right, which again is a Karban where the entire animal, right, is consumed on the Mizbeach, right, that actually is what the word Holocaust actually means, right? Holocaust in its earliest sense, before it took on its 20th century meaning, means totally burnt, right? And that's the description of the Karban Olah. But we also have a Korban Shlamim mentioned here. What's a Korban Shlamim? So that's actually an interesting question, what the words actually mean. But in general, what's a Korban Shlamim? Right, it's a sacrifice that is small portions of it are offered on the altar, and the person bringing it, right, eats the rest of it, right? And as they eat it together, they invite people in with them, and it basically becomes, let's call it a sacred act of eating, right? You think of the Korban Pesach in certain ways as a specialized kind of Korban Shlamim, right? So it's very noteworthy, right? That here, and it's also in halacha, only a Jew is allowed to bring Korban Shlamim, right? In Ola, anybody, a non-Jew can bring a Korban Ola. In fact, a non-Jew is allowed to bring a Korban Ola according to halacha today, right? If a non-Jew wants to build an altar and offer Korban Ola in their backyard, they are in fact allowed to do so anywhere, right? But only a Jew can bring Korban Shlamim, because the idea that Korban Shlamim is a sacrifice which is, and it's going to sound very radical, it's shared with God, right? That I am having a the Mizbeach gets its due, and I am eating the rest of it. And again, there's something very covenantal about that idea of the Korban Shlamim, right? So it's very interesting that that's what we encounter over here in the section of the forging of the covenant. We'll see that becomes significant later on. So we will, in fact, we'll stop over here for the day. Amir Hashem, we are now back on track going forward. I will just to let people know, there is next Thursday, in addition to the regular shir, there is a lunch and learn program. It's a legal holiday next week, a women's lunch, chavrusa study, and shir program, which should be very exciting if people are available at that time. I think it's 12 to 2 on next Thursday, December 25th. So if that's something which appeals to you, you are welcome to join us and add to the program. Good, a good day, a good Erev Shabbos, and Chanukah. So thank you kindly.